The air hung heavy and still, a suffocating blanket woven from the relentless southern sun and the fine red dust that perpetually coated everything. It was 1848, and on this sprawling cotton plantation, time moved not by the clock, but by the sun's merciless arc and the crack of a whip. A small, silent crowd of enslaved men and women stood huddled, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them, a tableau of familiar terror. At its center, a woman named Alara stood with her back to the overseer, her shoulders squared, her simple homespun dress already pulled down to bare her dark, scarred skin. There was no tremor in her posture, no visible sign of the pleading or desperate cries that usually preceded such an event. Her stillness was profound, almost eerie, a stark contrast to the palpable fear that radiated from the onlookers, a fear they knew all too well, etched into their very bones. The overseer, a man named Jericho, whose reputation for casual brutality preceded him like a foul stench, gripped a long leather whip in his hand. His face was a mask of cold, unyielding authority, his eyes glinting with a cruel satisfaction as he surveyed Alara's bared back. "You think you can defy me, woman," he snarled, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence, a chilling, dehumanizing command that stripped away not just Alara's dignity, but the very humanity of every soul present. "You think you can slow my harvest? I'll teach you what happens when you cross Jericho." He raised the whip, its shadow momentarily falling across Alara like a predatory bird. But instead of the expected shriek, instead of a desperate plea, a low, resonant hum began to emanate from Alara. It was a sound unexpected, a deep vibration born not of fear, but of an ancient sorrow, of an unyielding spirit that refused to break. It was a sound that seemed to rise from the very earth itself, through her feet, up through her core and out into the stifling air. The overseer paused, his hand already arcing the whip, faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something unreadable, confusion, perhaps a momentary discomfort, or even a fleeting, superstitious unease, crossed his hardened features. The whip dipped, held suspended, its cruel purpose momentarily arrested by this singular, inexplicable sound. What happened in that moment was not just a pause in violence, it was the beginning of a legend, a song that would, in time, change everything on this plantation, an act of profound, unexpected justice born from the most unexpected courage. Before we continue this extraordinary tale, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments below. Your engagement helps us share more vital stories from history. The year 1848 was a harsh crucible for millions of souls across the American South. The institution of slavery, deeply entrenched and brutally enforced, shaped every aspect of life, dictating destinies with an iron fist. On plantations like this one, existence was a relentless cycle of toil, deprivation, and the ever-present threat of violence. This particular estate, a vast expanse of rich, dark earth, stretched for miles, its fields dominated by the hungry demands of cotton. From the first blush of dawn until the last sliver of twilight vanished beyond the horizon, the enslaved population labored under the unblinking eye of the sun and the ever-watchful gaze of the overseers. The cotton harvest, a particularly grueling season, demanded every ounce of strength and endurance. Hands bled, backs ached, and spirits were tested daily as sacks grew heavy with the white, fluffy bolls. But even outside the harvest, the work never ceased. Planting, weeding, mending fences, tending livestock, and performing countless domestic chores for the master's house. Rest was a luxury rarely afforded, and when it came, it was often broken by exhaustion or the gnawing anxiety of the next day's demands. Living conditions were rudimentary at best. Small, cramped cabins, often shared by multiple families, offered little respite from the elements or the pervasive dampness. Rations were meager, just enough to sustain the rigorous labor, consisting primarily of cornmeal, salt pork, and whatever vegetables could be grown in small, illicit gardens. Malnutrition was a constant companion, weakening bodies and making them susceptible to disease. Medical care, when it was available, was often inadequate, if not entirely withheld, leaving ailments to fester and claim lives with heartbreaking regularity. Constant surveillance was another insidious layer of oppression. Every movement, every conversation, every gathering was scrutinized, making genuine privacy an impossible dream. The threat of the whip, the stocks, or even sale to a distant plantation loomed large, a terrifying reminder of their precarious existence. Yet, within this brutal framework, the enslaved community found ways to endure, to resist, and to preserve their humanity. Shared suffering forged unbreakable bonds of camaraderie and mutual support. Hidden networks of communication, passed through hushed whispers and coded songs, allowed news, warnings, and solace to travel across fields and between cabins. Cultural preservation became an act of defiance, a quiet assertion of identity. Stories of ancestors, tales of freedom, and spirituals rich with double meanings were passed down, keeping hope alive in the darkest hours. These traditions were not mere entertainment. They were lifelines, anchoring a people adrift in a sea of oppression, reminding them of who they were beyond the labels of their bondage. Ilara, in this community, was a woman of quiet observation. She wasn't one for boisterous displays or open defiance, but her presence held a steady, unwavering strength. Her eyes, deep and knowing, seemed to absorb the suffering and the small joys around her, holding them within. She was known, though perhaps not widely spoken of, for a subtle, almost ethereal talent for melody. Sometimes, during the brief stolen moments of evening gatherings, a low, melodic hum would escape her lips, a sound that seemed to soothe troubled hearts and momentarily lift the crushing weight of their reality. It was never a performance, always an unconscious emanation of her spirit. This quiet dignity, this refusal to be completely broken by the system, had perhaps in subtle ways already marked her. There had been early, almost imperceptible tensions with Overseer Jericho. Her calm demeanor, her refusal to meet his gaze with anything but a steady, unblinking awareness was a silent challenge to his absolute authority. He was accustomed to fear, to cowering, to broken spirits. Ilara's quiet resilience was an anomaly, an irritant, a seed of future conflict in the fertile ground of his brutality. The power imbalance was inherent, absolute, and yet, in Ilara, there was a spark, barely visible, that hinted at a different kind of power, one that even Jericho, in his dominion, might not fully comprehend. The stage was set, not just for another act of cruelty, but for a confrontation that would echo far beyond the dusty fields of this single plantation. Ilara's strength, that quiet, unyielding defiance that had momentarily frozen the overseer's whip, was not born of sudden courage. It was a deep, ancestral current, flowing through generations, a legacy of resilience woven into the very fabric of her being. Her earliest memories were not of the brutal cotton fields or the master's cold gaze, but of evenings spent huddled close to her grandmother, a woman whose hands bore the scars of endless labor, yet whose voice held the warmth of 1,000 suns. Grandmother Annika, her eyes like polished obsidian, would hum melodies that spoke of ancient lands, of rivers that flowed backward, of spirits that danced in the baobab trees. She wasn't a griot in the formal sense, no celebrated keeper of oral histories, but within the confines of their enslaved community, her songs and stories were the very breath of life, a vital link to a heritage that the slavers sought to erase. Ilara learned early that music was more than sound. It was memory, prayer, and a whispered rebellion. It was how they mourned the lost, celebrated clandestine joys, and passed down the wisdom of survival. Her own mother, a quiet woman with nimble fingers for weaving, had taught Ilara the intricate rhythms of field songs, how to blend her voice with others to create a tapestry of sound that lightened the crushing weight of labor, transforming shared suffering into a collective, albeit temporary, solace. These traditions instilled in Ilara a profound sense of identity, a connection to a lineage that stretched far beyond the confines of Master Thorne's plantation. It was a connection that whispered promises of dignity and an unbreakable spirit, even when her body was weary and her heart heavy. This quiet communion with her past fostered in her a deep, almost spiritual defiance, a refusal to be utterly consumed by the dehumanizing system that held her captive. She carried within her the echoes of a vibrant culture, a repository of strength that lay dormant, waiting for the moment it would be called upon. The man who stood poised to unleash his fury, Overseer Jericho, was a stark contrast to Ilara's deep-rooted humanity. He was a product of the very system he so ruthlessly enforced, a man carved from the harsh landscape of the antebellum South. Jericho had not inherited his position, but had clawed his way up, proving his worth through relentless efficiency and an unshakable commitment to the master's bottom line. His eyes, often narrowed against the sun, held a perpetual glint of suspicion, and his mouth was set in a thin, unforgiving line. He had learned early that fear was the most potent tool on a plantation, and he wielded it with surgical precision. He wasn't a man given to grand theatrical displays of cruelty, but rather a chilling pragmatism, a methodical application of force designed to break spirits and extract maximum labor. His background was shrouded in the vague rumors of a hardscrabble life, a man who had seen enough poverty to equate it with weakness, and enough desperation to believe that absolute control was the only path to order. He had absorbed the prevailing ideology of the time, the insidious belief in racial superiority, and the conviction that enslaved people were little more than property, requiring a firm hand and constant discipline. His cruelties were not born of passion, but of cold calculation. There was the time he denied old Thomas, a man whose bones ached with every movement, the simple comfort of a blanket during a harsh winter, stating gruffly that weakness breeds weakness. There were the arbitrary punishments, a dozen lashes for a perceived slow pace, or the casual disregard for human life, like when he left a sick child unattended, insisting the mother return to the fields, only for the child to succumb to fever by nightfall. These weren't isolated incidents. They were threads in a continuous tapestry of callousness that defined his rule. Ilara, with her quiet dignity and unwavering gaze, had always been a thorn in Jericho's side, though he rarely acknowledged it. She never openly defied him, never raised her voice in protest, but there was an unspoken challenge in her very presence, a refusal to completely crumble under his authority. He saw it in the way she carried herself, the way her eyes met his without flinching, the way she would sometimes hum softly to herself, a melody that seemed to mock the silence he imposed. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible tension, but it was there, a silent battle of wills between the overseer's brute force and Ilara's quiet, indomitable spirit. The community, though terrified of Jericho, also recognized Ilara's inner strength, whispering about her quiet resilience, sensing that she harbored a courage that transcended their collective despair. They knew Jericho's harshness was escalating, his grip tightening with each passing season, making the air on the plantation heavy with a suffocating dread. Yet, in Ilara, they saw a flicker of something different, a silent promise that some spirits, however oppressed, could never truly be broken. The relentless sun beat down upon the thorn plantation, but it was not merely the physical heat that caused a suffocating oppression to settle over the enslaved community. A far more insidious warmth, born of systematic disrespect and calculated degradation, slowly corroded the very fabric of human dignity. Overseer Jericho, a man whose heart seemed to be carved from the same unforgiving stone as the plantation paths, orchestrated this erosion with chilling precision. His methods were not always the whip, though its shadow perpetually loomed. Often they were far more subtle, designed to break the spirit before the body. Promises, once whispered like fleeting hopes in the stifling air, became Jericho's cruelest instruments. After a particularly brutal cotton harvest, one that saw fingers bleeding and backs aching past endurance, the master, Thorn himself, had declared a rare half-day of rest, a fleeting reprieve for the exhausted souls. Hope, fragile and tentative, had blossomed. Children dared to dream of playing, adults of simply sitting in silence. But as the designated afternoon approached, Jericho, his face a mask of cold indifference, rescinded the promise. "The fields call louder than your weary bones," he had sneered, his voice devoid of any empathy. The collective sigh that swept through the quarters was not one of defiance, but of profound, crushing disappointment, a sound Ilara would carry in her memory for years. Each broken promise was a fresh wound, festering with distrust and a deepening sense of betrayal, reminding them that their humanity, their needs, their very existence, held no weight against the whims of their oppressors. The emotional aggressions were relentless, a constant barrage of verbal abuse designed to chip away at their self-worth. Jericho had a particular talent for demeaning pronouncements, his words sharp as a razor's edge. He would often gather them, not for instruction, but for public lectures on their supposed inherent laziness, their intellectual inferiority, or their animalistic nature. "You are naught but beasts of burden," he would bellow, his eyes sweeping over their bowed heads, and beasts require a firm hand, not a gentle word. These tirades, delivered with a sneering contempt, were threats thinly veiled, designed to instill a paralyzing fear, to extinguish any spark of individuality. Ilara, ever observant, saw the way these words settled upon her people, heavy and suffocating, pushing them further into the silent corners of their own minds, where dignity could perhaps still be secretly harbored. But perhaps the most profound and scarring aspect of Jericho's cruelty, and indeed the entire system he upheld, was the casual, brutal separation and loss of families. Ilara had witnessed it firsthand more times than she cared to remember, each instance tearing a fresh hole in the collective soul of the community. She recalled the day young Samuel, no more than 7 years old, was ripped from his mother's arms, sold to a distant plantation for a debt Master Thorne had accrued. The boy's piercing cries, his mother's guttural primal scream of anguish, echoed through the fields, a sound that transcended mere pain and became a testament to unbearable injustice. Ilara had held the mother that night, feeling the raw, shaking grief, the inconsolable emptiness that such an act left behind. These narratives of loss, repeated through generations, were not just stories. They were living scars, indelible marks of helplessness that permeated every corner of their existence. The deliberate withholding of necessities was another testament to the profound disregard for their well-being. Rations, already meager, became even scarcer under Jericho's tightening grip. The cornmeal was often worm-ridden, the salted pork rancid, and the single change of clothing provided for a year would quickly become threadbare, offering little protection against the biting winter winds or the scorching summer sun. Their cabins, little more than dilapidated shacks, offered scant shelter, their leaky roofs and dirt floors breeding sickness and despair. Ilara remembered the cold, shivering nights, huddled with others, listening to the coughs and whimpers of children, knowing that Jericho's deliberate neglect was slowly, systematically, eroding their strength, leaving them perpetually on the edge of starvation and illness. It was a slow violence, less dramatic than the whip but equally devastating, demonstrating a chilling indifference to their very survival. Even small acts of public humiliation were meticulously employed to reinforce power dynamics and crush any sense of individual worth. A dropped tool, a moment of perceived slowness, or a missed instruction could lead to a public shaming. Ilara once saw an elderly woman, Martha, forced to stand for hours in the midday sun, a heavy wooden sign around her neck proclaiming "slow hand." Martha, whose hands were gnarled and stiff from decades of labor, wept silently, her dignity stripped away under the mocking gaze of Jericho and the pained, averted eyes of her community. These trivial punishments, disproportionate in their cruelty, were designed to break spirits, to remind every enslaved person of their precarious position, their lack of agency, and their utter vulnerability. Through each of these agonizing episodes, Ilara moved with a quiet observation, her outward calm belying the tempest brewing within. She saw the despair settling like a shroud over her people, the way their eyes lost their spark, the way their shoulders slumped under the weight of unrelenting oppression. She felt the slow burning of resentment, a deep, hot ember within her chest that refused to be extinguished. Every broken promise, every demeaning word, every tear shed for a lost child, every shiver of hunger, Every public humiliation became a thread woven into a tapestry of profound injustice. Her understanding of the deep wrongness of their situation grew with each passing day, transforming from a quiet sadness into a resolute, though still silent, determination. The collective impact on the enslaved community was palpable. Despair and a pervasive sense of powerlessness had become their constant companions, their spirits slowly being crushed under the relentless heel of Jericho's systematic degradation. The air was thick not just with heat, but with unspoken pain, a heavy silence that seemed to precede a storm. The oppressive silence on the plantation was a stifling, suffocating anticipation, a tension so palpable it made each breath labored. Jericho, the overseer, had always been cruel, but in recent weeks his temper was a live wire, sparking unpredictably. Minor infractions now drew disproportionate, brutal punishments. A spilled bucket of water could earn a man a night in the stocks. A moment's hesitation in the fields might lead to a woman being forced to work extra hours under the blistering sun. This escalating cruelty wasn't entirely born of his own malice. Whispers carried on the wind spoke of neighboring plantations tightening their grip, of masters demanding higher yields and stricter control in a volatile economic climate. Jericho, ever eager to prove his worth and secure his position, seemed intent on outdoing his peers, on becoming the most feared, the most efficient, the most utterly ruthless overseer in the county. His eyes, once merely cold, now held a glint of manic desperation, a hunger for control that seemed to consume him entirely. Through the enslaved community, these whispers of discontent and frustration rippled like unseen currents beneath a calm surface. Open rebellion, they all knew, was a dangerous, often fatal prospect. The cost was too high, the consequences too dire. Yet the yearning for freedom, for dignity, for an end to the unending torment grew stronger with each passing day. It manifested in small acts of defiance, a tool deliberately dulled, a row of cotton picked slightly less efficiently, a song sung with a hidden message of hope and resilience. But these were mere pinpricks against the vast, impenetrable armor of their oppression. The collective spirit, though bruised and battered, refused to be entirely broken, clinging to the smallest threads of shared humanity and clandestine resistance. Ilara moved through these days with an increasing burden of psychological weight. Every lash that fell on another's back, every cry of pain, every silent tear, felt like a blow to her own soul. The air was thick with unspoken fear. Yes, but also with a growing sense of righteous indignation that simmered just beneath her composed exterior. She saw the children's eyes, wide with terror, learning too young the brutal lessons of their existence. She saw the elders, their bodies failing, forced to continue laboring until their last breath. The injustice was a physical ache in her chest, a constant throbbing pain that intensified with each passing sunrise. One sweltering afternoon, as the sun beat down mercilessly on the cotton fields, Ilara witnessed an act so profoundly cruel, so utterly devoid of humanity, that it pushed her closer to her breaking point than anything before. Young Caleb, barely 10 years old, had been tasked with carrying water to the field hands. His small, thin frame struggled with the heavy wooden bucket, his bare feet sinking into the loose soil. Exhausted, dehydrated, and weakened by hunger, he stumbled, sending the precious water splashing onto the parched earth. Jericho, who had been observing from horseback, let out a roar that echoed across the fields, a sound like a beast. He dismounted, his face contorted with a fury that seemed to have no bounds. He grabbed Caleb by the arm, yanking the boy roughly to his feet, ignoring the child's whimpers of pain and terror. Ilara watched, her heart a drum against her ribs, as Jericho raised his whip, not to strike but to deliver a public, humiliating lesson. He forced Caleb to his knees, then, with a chilling smile, poured the remaining dribble of water from the bucket over the boy's head, mocking his thirst, his weakness. Then he instructed another enslaved man, a large, silent individual named Thomas, to take Caleb and tie him to the whipping post, not for a lashing, but to stand for the remainder of the day, without water, as an example. Let him learn the value of water and the cost of his clumsiness. Jericho sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Caleb's small, desperate cries as he was led away, his eyes wide and pleading, were a dagger to Ilara's soul. She saw the terror in his face, the utter helplessness. She saw the collective shame and anger in the faces of her community, their hands clenched, their gazes lowered, unable to intervene. This was not just a punishment, it was a psychological torture, a deliberate breaking of a child's spirit. A public display designed to crush any remaining hope. It was a calculated act of evil that transcended mere discipline. Ilara felt a tremor run through her, a profound shift in her resolve. The quiet observation, the slow burning of resentment, had reached its zenith. Something within her snapped. This particular act against a vulnerable, innocent child was the final straw, pushing her beyond the limits of passive endurance, igniting a spark that had long smoldered beneath the surface. The incident with Caleb, though not involving Ilara directly, resonated through her with a force that was physical. It crystallized her understanding of Jericho's unbridled malevolence, his capacity for cruelty that knew no bounds, not even for a child. His actions were not merely harsh, but strategically reckless, designed to isolate, to terrorize, to leave absolutely no room for mercy or negotiation. He was not just an overseer, he was a force of destruction, systematically dismantling the humanity of everyone under his control. The air on the plantation grew heavier still, charged with the unspoken question of who would be next, what new horror would unfold. Jericho, seemingly emboldened by the lack of direct reprisal for Caleb's torment, spiraled further into his ruthless authoritarianism. His ego, inflated by his perceived absolute power, began to make him blind to the simmering discontent, the quiet desperation that was reaching a boiling point. He committed a series of grave errors, pushing the situation beyond any semblance of endurance. Not content with the general climate of fear, he began to target individuals with an implacable, almost personal, ruthlessness. It began subtly, with the denial of small comforts, then escalated. One evening, he announced with a sneer that the Sunday gatherings, a cherished time for spiritual solace and communal song, were henceforth forbidden. Too much noise, too much idleness, he spat, extinguishing one of the few remaining flames of hope and cultural preservation. This was a direct assault on their spirit, a deliberate attempt to sever their connection to their heritage and to each other. But the true provocation, the one that cemented Ilara's resolve and left her with no further avenues for passive endurance, came just days later. It was a quiet morning, unusually cool for the season, a deceptive calm before the storm. Ilara had been tending to the small communal garden patch, a place where a few meager vegetables were grown to supplement their diets. Old Sarah, a woman whose gentle spirit and wisdom had often been a quiet comfort to Ilara, was beside her, humming a faint, almost inaudible melody. Sarah had been ill for some time, her cough worsening with each passing week, her strength fading. She was no longer able to work the fields, a fact Jericho had often grumbled about. Suddenly, Jericho appeared, dismounting his horse with an air of grim purpose. His gaze fell upon Sarah, a calculating, cold appraisal in his eyes. Without a word, he addressed the other enslaved people nearby, his voice devoid of emotion. "Old Sarah here," he began, his tone chillingly casual, "is no longer fit for purpose. She consumes more than she produces. I have arranged for her to be sold. She leaves with the next transport tomorrow morning to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. They need strong hands there. Perhaps the change of scenery will do her good." The words hung in the air, a death knell. Sarah, frail and trembling, gasped, her eyes wide with terror. Louisiana was a death sentence for someone of her age and condition, a place of brutal, unending labor that would quickly claim her life. It meant permanent separation from the only family she had left, from the only home she had ever known. Her soft hum died on her lips, replaced by a choked sob. Ilara felt a cold, hard knot form in her stomach. This was not just cruelty. It was a deliberate, targeted act of dehumanization, tearing apart the fabric of their community, striking at the heart of their oldest and most vulnerable. It was a profound affront to Alara, because Sarah represented the quiet dignity, the spiritual resilience, the ancient wisdom that Jericho sought so desperately to extinguish. To sell Sarah was to sell their very soul, to declare that even the gentle, the wise, the infirm had no place, no value, beyond their physical capacity for labor. It was an act of profound, unforgivable evil. In that moment, Alara knew, with an absolute certainty that resonated through her bones, that she could not, would not, allow this to happen. Her patience, her long-suffering endurance, had reached its absolute limit. The existing power dynamic, the unspoken agreement of passive resistance, was about to shatter. A major, defining confrontation was no longer imminent. It was inevitable. The storm had arrived, and Alara, against all odds, was ready to meet it. Her voice, long a vessel for quiet lament, was about to become something else entirely. The heavy silence that had settled over the plantation, a silence thick with unspoken pain, did not precede a storm of nature, but a tempest of human cruelty and an unexpected, profound defiance. The air, already stifling with the late afternoon heat, grew impossibly dense, pressing down on every soul, a prelude to an unbearable injustice that would shatter the fragile veneer of endurance. The catalyst arrived in the form of a small, frightened boy named Caleb, no older than 7, his slight frame trembling as he stood accused. His crime was the theft of a single withered apple, discovered clutched in his tiny hand by one of Jericho's ever-vigilant drivers. The apple, undoubtedly intended to quell the gnawing hunger that was Caleb's constant companion, was now the instrument of his potential doom. Jericho, his face already flushed crimson from the heat and an earlier argument with a field hand, saw in Caleb's transgression not a desperate act of survival, but a direct challenge to his authority, a crack in the edifice of his control. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, now burned with an almost manic rage, reflecting the unchecked power that had corrupted him entirely. He bellowed for Caleb to be brought forward, his voice ripping through the oppressive quiet. The boy, tears streaming down his face, offered no defense, only a series of choked whimpers that tore at the hearts of the gathered enslaved people who were forced to bear witness. Jericho snatched the whip from its hook, the leather cracking ominously in the air, a sound that usually signaled the end of all hope. He stood poised, his arm raised, ready to deliver a brutal, disproportionate punishment that would undoubtedly leave the child scarred, perhaps permanently broken, both in body and spirit. The sight was too much, a stark illustration of the antagonist's implacable ruthlessness, pushing the situation beyond any semblance of human endurance. Alara, standing in the front row, felt an overwhelming surge of emotion that transcended mere anger or fear. It was a primal, gut-wrenching pain, a feeling that every broken promise, every demeaning word, every tear shed for a lost child, every shiver of hunger, every public humiliation had coalesced into this single, agonizing moment. Seeing Caleb, so small, so utterly vulnerable, about to be subjected to such barbarity, something within her snapped. It was not a conscious decision to act, not a calculated choice born of defiance, but an instinctual, spiritual response, a deep, ancient need to intervene, to protect, to express the unspeakable suffering of her people that had been suppressed for far too long. Her throat tightened, not with a sob, but with a burgeoning pressure, a force demanding release. Then, from deep within her chest, a sound began to emanate. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air, a sound born of deep sorrow and an unyielding spirit. It was wordless, yet it carried the weight of generations of pain, the echo of ancestral voices, the silent lament of countless souls who had suffered under the whip. The hum gradually built in intensity, a mournful, undulating melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself, flowing through Alara and out into the tense silence. It was not a song of defiance nor an outburst of anger, but a profound, haunting lament, a raw, unadulterated expression of grief, loss, and the enduring human spirit that refused to be extinguished. The melody was unlike anything heard on the plantation before. It was slow, ethereal, weaving intricate patterns of sound that seemed to paint pictures of sun-drenched savannas, of distant drumbeats, of the tears shed on slave ships and the desperate prayers whispered in cotton fields. It was a song of profound sorrow, yes, but also a testament to an unyielding resilience, a quiet strength that pulsed beneath the surface of despair. The notes hung in the air, vibrating with an ancient energy, touching something primal within everyone who heard it. The other enslaved people, who had been bracing themselves for Caleb's cries, now stood frozen, their eyes wide with a mixture of confusion, awe, and a nascent, fragile hope. They watched Alara, her eyes closed, her face a mask of profound, almost spiritual concentration, as the melody poured from her, filling the space with its haunting beauty. Jericho, his arm still raised, the whip poised to strike, faltered. The sound, so unexpected, so utterly out of place in the brutal landscape of his authority, pierced through his hardened exterior. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his eyes widening in confusion. Then a flicker of unease, perhaps even a superstitious fear, crossed his face. The raw, unfiltered emotion of the song, a pure conduit of human suffering and dignity, seemed to bypass his conscious mind and touch something long buried within him. The crackling rage that had consumed him began to dissipate, replaced by a disorienting sense of discomfort. The whip still clutched in his hand seemed to grow impossibly heavy. His arm, which moments ago had been rigid with intent, trembled slightly, then slowly, almost involuntarily, began to lower. The menacing leather tip, which had promised untold pain, now drifted towards the dusty ground, its power temporarily nullified by the sheer, unadulterated force of Alara's voice. The song continued, a river of sorrow and strength, holding everyone captive, including Jericho himself, in its powerful current. He found himself unable to move, unable to speak, unable to break the spell cast by the haunting melody. A collective silent gasp rippled through the enslaved community. They watched, mesmerized, as the instrument of their torment slowly surrendered its threat. It was an unprecedented and miraculous act of intervention, a moment of profound spiritual defiance witnessed by all. Ilara's song had not been a plea, but an assertion, a primal declaration of humanity that transcended the chains that bound them. She stood there, a vessel for the collective pain and enduring spirit of her people, her voice weaving a tapestry of sound that momentarily suspended the brutal reality of their existence, creating a fragile, sacred space where the whip held no power, and a child's life was spared by the sheer, resonant force of a single, unforgettable song. The whipping stopped. The overseer Jericho stood frozen, the thick leather whip dangling limply from his hand. The brutal instrument of torture suddenly rendered useless. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself. The rage that had been burning within him, a familiar and comforting heat, had abruptly cooled, leaving behind a strange, unsettling emptiness. He felt disoriented, as if he had been yanked from a fever dream and thrust into a reality he no longer understood. The raw, unfiltered emotion in Ilara's song had pierced through his hardened exterior, touching something long buried, something he had actively tried to suppress for years. A flicker of forgotten humanity, a ghost of empathy stirred within him, creating a profound discomfort. He looked at the woman who had been seconds away from feeling the lash of his whip. Her back, still bared, was a canvas of old scars and fresh welts, a testament to the brutality he had inflicted. And the thought, for the first time, made him uneasy. He couldn't meet her eyes, couldn't bear to see the defiance, the sorrow, or perhaps even the pity that might be reflected there. He glanced around at the other enslaved people, their faces a mixture of shock, wonder, and a nascent, cautious hope. He saw the fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else, something new, a spark of defiance, a glimmer of belief that perhaps, just perhaps, things could be different. The silence that followed the song was profound, heavy, charged with unspoken questions and a fragile sense of hope. It was a silence unlike any he had ever experienced on the plantation. Not the silence of fear and submission, but the silence of contemplation, of possibility. It pressed down on him, suffocating him, making him long for the familiar crack of the whip, the satisfying sound of pain that had always reaffirmed his authority. Ilara stood motionless, physically and emotionally drained, yet strangely resolute. The song had emptied her of a deep burden, a lifetime of sorrow and suppressed rage. She felt a quiet inner strength, a sense of purpose she had never known before. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of peace, a conviction that she had done something right, something that mattered. She had spoken the unspeakable, sung the unsingable, and in doing so, she had momentarily broken the chains that bound them all. The immediate physical consequences were stark. The young man who was about to be whipped was spared, his body unmarked, his spirit unbroken. The whip, Jericho's symbol of power, lay uselessly on the ground, its potency temporarily nullified. The emotional shift on the plantation was palpable. The enslaved people stood a little straighter, their eyes a little brighter. They moved with a newfound sense of dignity, as if Ilara's song had infused them with a renewed sense of their own humanity. Jericho felt his authority, once absolute, subtly and irrevocably undermined. He could still command, still punish, but the weight of his words, the sting of his whip had been diminished. He was no longer the unquestioned master of their lives, but a man whose power had been challenged, a man whose actions were now subject to scrutiny, not just by the enslaved, but by his own conscience, a conscience he had long tried to ignore. Almost immediately, the story of the song began to spread, whispered in hushed tones, first within the confines of the plantation, then slowly to neighboring ones, carried by the invisible currents of the enslaved community's communication networks. It was a legend in the making, a tale of courage, of spiritual power, of the transformative potential of art. It was a story that gave hope to the hopeless, strength to the weak, and a voice to the voiceless. It was a song that stopped a whipping, and in doing so, it had planted the seeds of something far greater, something that could potentially blossom into a future where the brutality and injustice of slavery would be replaced by freedom and equality. The song was a spark in the darkness, and it was spreading. The days that followed Ilara's song were steeped in an unfamiliar quiet, a tension that hummed beneath the surface of the plantation's relentless rhythm. Overseer Jericho, a man once defined by his brutal certainty, found himself adrift in this new, unsettling atmosphere. He attempted to reassert his absolute control, barking orders with his usual ferocity, but the commands lacked their former conviction. The whip, once an extension of his will, felt heavy and alien in his hand, its power diminished by the memory of a sound that had pierced through his hardened exterior. His eyes, once quick to catch every infraction, now seemed to dart away, avoiding the gazes of the enslaved people, especially Ilara's. He found himself inexplicably uncomfortable in her presence, a disquiet that gnawed at him, forcing him to keep a distance, to delegate tasks that would bring him near her. His visible discomfort was a silent testament to the song's lingering power. He would often find himself staring blankly at the fields, his thoughts fractured, the haunting melody replaying in his mind. The sharp edges of his cruelty had been dulled, not by compassion but by a profound unease, a superstitious dread of the unknown force that Ilara had momentarily unleashed. He could not bring himself to administer whippings with the same casual brutality. The image of Ilara's resolute face and the sound of her sorrowful song forever intertwined with the act. His punishments became less frequent, less severe, as if he feared invoking that spiritual defiance once more. Ilara, for her part, was undergoing a profound internal journey. The act of singing had emptied her, yet simultaneously filled her with an incredible, quiet strength. She processed the profound spiritual act she had committed, slowly understanding the immense power she had unknowingly wielded. It was not a power born of physical strength or defiance, but one rooted in the deepest wells of human emotion and ancestral memory. She felt a connection to something ancient, something sacred, a current flowing through her that transcended her physical bondage. This understanding brought with it a growing confidence, not in outward displays but in the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. She emerged as a revered figure within the enslaved community, a symbol of resilience and a keeper of hope. Her quiet leadership was not proclaimed but felt, her presence a steady anchor in their turbulent lives. When despair threatened to overwhelm them, they would look to Alara or seek her out, finding solace in her calm demeanor and the quiet strength radiating from her. Her song, now a legend, was whispered in hushed tones, sung softly in secret gatherings, a beacon of defiance that reminded them of their shared humanity and the enduring power of their spirit. It became a lullaby for frightened children, a prayer for the weary, a defiant hum against the omnipresent shadows. Small, yet undeniably significant victories began to emerge on the plantation. The frequency of whippings, once a daily terror, decreased noticeably. Certain particularly cruel practices, like the arbitrary separation of families for minor offenses, seemed to diminish. Rations, while still meager, were sometimes slightly more consistent, and the brutal dawn-to-dusk pace occasionally slackened, allowing for a few extra moments of rest. These were not grand reforms, nor did they dismantle the system of slavery, but they were tangible shifts, small cracks in the edifice of daily terror that allowed a sliver of light to penetrate. Each small concession, each moment of reduced suffering, was attributed to Alara's song, reinforcing its mythic status and her evolving role as a spiritual protector. Alara began to understand herself not merely as an enslaved person, but as a vessel for a powerful spiritual force that transcended her physical bondage. Her voice had become an instrument of something greater than herself, a conduit for the collective pain and enduring hope of her people. This realization did not make her arrogant, but imbued her with a profound sense of responsibility and purpose. She saw the fear in the overseer's eyes, the subtle hesitation in his movements, and knew that the song had not just stopped a whipping, but had planted a seed of doubt, a seed that might one day blossom into something more profound. The community, once fragmented by fear and suffering, rallied around her, drawing immense strength from her singular act. They found new, subtle ways to resist, to maintain their humanity, inspired by her courage. Acts of quiet sabotage, moments of shared laughter, and covert gatherings became more frequent, each a small act of defiance against the dehumanizing system. They understood that Alara had given them more than just a song. She had given them a voice, a collective spirit that could not be broken. The narrative advanced towards a new, fragile normal on the plantation. The chains of slavery remained, but their weight felt subtly different. The memory of the song acted as both a deterrent to the oppressor and a source of enduring inner strength for the oppressed. It was a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, a single act of profound humanity, a single song, could ignite a quiet revolution, forever altering the landscape of power and dignity. The echoes of Alara's song, though often silent, continued to resonate, a promise of a future where true freedom might one day bloom. The song was a spark in the darkness, and it was spreading. Jericho, however, found himself trapped in a different kind of darkness, one of his own making, amplified by the haunting echo of Alara's voice. The silence that had fallen after her song on that fateful day had never truly lifted for him. It lingered, a constant oppressive presence that seeped into the very foundations of his being, eroding the brutal certainty that had once defined him. He tried, in the days and weeks that followed, to resume his old ways, to wield the whip with the same unfeeling force, to issue commands with the same chilling authority. Yet each time his hand reached for the coiled leather, a phantom melody seemed to weave its way through his thoughts, a lament so profound it froze the cruelty in his veins. He would falter, his grip weakening, the intended strike never quite landing with the same conviction. The raw, guttural rage that had fueled his punishments now felt hollow, an empty echo against the resonant power of Alara's sorrow. His attempts at reasserting dominance became increasingly futile. The enslaved people, though still bound by the chains of their condition, carried themselves with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. Their eyes, once filled only with fear and resignation, now held a guarded knowing, a quiet defiance that spoke volumes without a single word. They had witnessed his momentary paralysis, felt the tremor in his once unyielding hand, and understood that something fundamental had fractured within him. Jericho's commands, though still obeyed, lacked their former terror. The whippings, when they occurred, were fewer and less brutal, often administered by a subordinate whom he could no longer bring himself to supervise with the same meticulous, sadistic pleasure. He found himself avoiding Ilara, unable to meet her gaze, the memory of her song an invisible branding on his soul. Word of his perceived weakness began to spread beyond the plantation's borders. Other slave owners, men whose cruelty he had once emulated and surpassed, looked at him with a mixture of disdain and suspicion. He was whispered about as soft, superstitious, a man whose grip on his property had loosened. His once sterling reputation as an efficient, ruthless manager of human chattel began to tarnish, affecting his standing in the community and, inevitably, his finances. The value of his plantation, once a thriving testament to his harsh methods, slowly began to decline. He found it increasingly difficult to sell off surplus enslaved people, as buyers heard the rumors of the strange, unquantifiable shifts on his land, sensing a disruption in the established order of absolute control. The moral decay he had inflicted upon others now turned inward, manifesting as a slow, insidious erosion of his own power, dignity, and internal peace. Ilara, meanwhile, lived out her days on the plantation, but her spirit was undeniably free. She became a revered figure, not just among those who had witnessed her song, but among generations that followed. Her act, born of desperation and courage, had transformed her from an enslaved woman into a living legend, a symbol of resilience and a keeper of hope. The song itself, though perhaps never sung exactly as she had that day, became a foundational story, whispered from elder to child, a secret language of resistance and spiritual power. It was a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, the human voice, imbued with profound emotion, could pierce through the thickest walls of oppression. Her quiet leadership was not about overt rebellion, but about instilling a quiet dignity, a belief in their inherent worth that no whip or chain could truly break. The ultimate justice in this story was not found in a dramatic, vengeful downfall of the oppressor, but in a far more profound and enduring transformation. Jericho's moral fall was a slow burn, a psychological torment that left him a shadow of his former self, haunted by an act of pure human expression he could neither comprehend nor forget. He eventually sold the plantation, not at a profit, but at a significant loss, retreating into an isolated existence, unable to escape the haunting echo of Ilara's voice. He succumbed to illness not long after, a man broken not by physical force, but by the weight of a song that had pierced his hardened exterior and exposed the barren landscape of his soul. Ilara, though still enslaved, had brought a profound measure of dignity and subtle, yet undeniable justice to her community, freeing them in spirit even before their bodies could follow. This narrative, stretching across the oppressive landscape of 1848, serves as a poignant testament to the indomitable power of the human spirit. It reminds us that justice does not always arrive with thunderous declarations or violent overthrow, but can sometimes manifest in the most unexpected and ethereal forms. Ilara's single haunting song was not merely a protest, it was a lament, a prayer, a declaration of humanity that resonated so deeply, it disrupted the very fabric of tyranny. It was an act of pure, transcendent human expression that proved impervious to the whip, to the chains, to the systemic dehumanization of slavery. Her story compels us to reflect on the enduring strength of art, of music, and of the raw, unfiltered voice in the face of unspeakable cruelty. It illustrates how one singular act, born of desperation and courage, can ripple through time, altering individual lives, fracturing the resolve of oppressors and inspiring entire communities to hold on to hope. Ilara's legacy is not just about a whipping that stopped. It is about the quiet revolution she ignited within the hearts of her people, a revolution of spirit and self-worth that no external force could ever truly extinguish. The haunting, eternal echo of her unforgettable song continues to remind us that even in the darkest of times, the melody of humanity, once truly heard, can never be silenced, leaving us in thoughtful silence, deeply moved by her extraordinary journey. The sun beat down on the sprawling fields of the Thorn Plantation in 1848, a relentless hammer against the backs of those toiling beneath it. The air, thick with the scent of parched earth and the unspoken dread of the day, hung heavy and still. A collective breath seemed to catch in the throats of the enslaved people gathered, their eyes fixed on the central figure. Ilara stood before the overseer, her posture remarkably straight, her back bared to the scorching light. There was no tremor in her stance, no visible plea in her downcast gaze, only a profound, almost eerie stillness that belied the palpable fear rippling through the small crowd. Overseer Jericho, a man whose name was synonymous with callous brutality across the county, gripped the coiled leather whip. Its shadow, stark against the dusty ground, seemed to writhe with a life of its own. His voice, a harsh guttural command, tore through the stifling silence. "You think you can defy me, woman? You think you are above the rules here?" The words were not a question but a pronouncement, a ritualistic prelude to the pain he was about to inflict. A dehumanizing declaration designed to crush spirit long before flesh. He raised his arm, the whip arcing back, ready to descend. But then, from Ilara's throat, a sound began to emerge. It was not a cry, nor a whimper, nor a plea for mercy, but something far more profound. It was a low, resonant hum, a vibration that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath her feet, carrying the weight of generations of sorrow, a melody born of an unyielding spirit. The sound was utterly unexpected, a deep, mournful current that seeped into the oppressive air, defying the harshness of the moment and challenging the very foundation of the overseer's power. Overseer Jericho paused, his arm already poised to strike, faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker, quick as a hummingbird's wing, crossed his eyes. Something unreadable, perhaps a sliver of confusion or even a nascent unease, a momentary lapse in his hardened resolve. The whip hung suspended, its intended trajectory interrupted by a sound no one had anticipated, a sound that seemed to carry the ancient echoes of an entire people's suffering and strength. This, dear viewer, was not merely a moment of defiance. It was the genesis of a legend, the beginning of a song that would forever alter the brutal landscape of this plantation, an act of justice born from the most unexpected and profound courage. Before we continue this remarkable journey, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. Your engagement helps us share these vital stories and keep these important histories alive. The year 1848 was a harsh testament to the enduring brutality of the American South's antebellum period, a time when human beings were treated as chattel, their lives dictated by the whims of their owners. The Thorn Plantation was a microcosm of this grim reality, a vast expanse of land where cotton reigned supreme, its white bowls representing both prosperity for the few and endless suffering for the many. From the first blush of dawn to the deep indigo of night, the enslaved labored under a sun that offered no quarter. The fields stretched endlessly, demanding back-breaking work, each fiber plucked a testament to their stolen lives. The rhythmic thud of hoes, the rustle of cotton plants, and the distant shouts of overseers formed the relentless soundtrack of their existence. Living conditions were rudimentary, a cruel parody of basic human habitation. Small, dilapidated cabins, often shared by multiple families, offered scant protection from the elements. Meals were meager rations of cornmeal and salt pork, just enough to sustain the strength needed for another day of relentless toil, never enough to truly nourish. Every movement, every conversation, was subject to constant surveillance, a pervasive atmosphere of suspicion and control that stifled any glimmer of independent thought. The threat of violence, arbitrary and swift, was an ever-present shadow, a constant reminder of their precarious existence. A misplaced tool, a moment of rest, a perceived insolence. Any of these could swiftly escalate into a brutal punishment, the crack of the whip a chilling punctuation mark in their daily lives. Yet within this crucible of suffering, the enslaved community forged an unbreakable bond. They were bound not just by their shared oppression, but by an extraordinary resilience, a quiet determination to preserve their humanity against overwhelming odds. Hidden networks of support flourished in the shadows, whispered words of encouragement, shared morsels of food, or a comforting touch in the darkest hours. They clung to their cultural heritage, adapting ancient traditions to their new horrific reality. Songs, stories, and spiritual practices became vital acts of resistance, preserving memory, communicating hope, and affirming their identity in a world that sought to deny it. These were not merely pastimes, they were the very sinews of their survival, threads of dignity woven into the fabric of their desperate lives. Ilara, though often quiet and observant, was deeply rooted in this community. She possessed an inner strength that manifested not in outward rebellion, but in a profound stillness, a quiet dignity that was almost unnerving to those who sought to break her. Her hands, though calloused from years in the fields, moved with a surprising grace. She was known, though perhaps only in hushed whispers, for a hidden talent for melody, a way of humming or singing that could soothe a crying child, or bring a momentary hush to a weary gathering. It was a gift she rarely displayed openly, a private solace she kept close to her heart. The overseer, Jericho, and even Master Thorn himself had long been aware of Ilara's quiet defiance, a subtle challenge to their absolute authority. Her refusal to meet their gaze with servility, her unbowed posture even under duress had marked her. There were no grand confrontations, no overt acts of rebellion from Ilara, but rather a persistent, almost imperceptible air of self-possession that grated on those accustomed to utter submission. This underlying tension, a simmering undercurrent of power imbalance, had slowly but inexorably built over time, leading to this very moment. Today, it seemed, her quiet strength had finally been deemed an affront too great to ignore, an act of silent resistance that demanded a public, brutal demonstration of control. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any other, where the very essence of humanity would clash against the crushing weight of oppression. The air thrummed, not just with heat, but with the impending, transformative power of a single haunting note. To truly grasp the profound power of Ilara's single haunting song, we must first journey back, not merely to the fields of 1848, but into the very fabric of her being, woven from generations of resilience and an inherited legacy of sound. Ilara was not born into silence. Her lineage stretched across the vast, churning ocean, rooted deep in the soil of West Africa, where griots were the living libraries of their people, carrying history, wisdom, and emotion on the currents of their voices. Though the brutal Middle Passage had severed many ties, the echoes of those traditions persisted on the plantation, a quiet, defiant hum beneath the surface of suffering. Her grandmother, a woman whose eyes held the weary wisdom of 100 sunsets, had been the first to teach Ilara the true language of melody, not just for joy, but for solace, for protest, for remembering. Ilara's childhood was a stark tapestry of contrasts. There were fleeting moments of peace, snatched between sunup and sundown, the soft lullaby her mother hummed as she braided Ilara's hair, the communal singing that accompanied the meager evening meal, or the clandestine storytelling sessions where ancestral tales, rich with animal tricksters and brave warriors, were whispered around dying embers. These were the breath of life, the spiritual sustenance that nourished her soul. Yet these fragile moments were always overshadowed by the omnipresent shadow of the lash, the relentless grind of the cotton fields, and the casual cruelty that could erupt without warning. She learned early that laughter could be a dangerous luxury, and that true strength often resided in stillness, in observation, in the quiet absorption of the world around her. From her earliest days, Elara understood that music was more than just a sound. It was a conduit. It connected her to the spirits of her ancestors, to the stories of those who had endured before her, and to the shared heart of her community. It was a language that transcended the spoken word, a secret code of sorrow and hope that the white overseers could never truly decipher. She watched, she listened, she absorbed. The rhythmic thud of the hoe in the earth, the mournful cry of a spiritual, the defiant beat of a hidden drum. All these sounds became part of her internal landscape. They instilled in her a deep, almost instinctual connection to a heritage that slavery sought relentlessly to erase. This ancestral wellspring of sound and story forged within Elara a quiet defiance, an unyielding spirit that refused to be broken. Even as her body labored under the relentless sun, she carried within her not just her own pain, but the collective memory of a people, a silent strength waiting for its moment to resonate. Against this backdrop of quiet resilience stood Overseer Jericho, a man whose very name would come to be synonymous with fear and suffering on the thorn plantation. Jericho was not born a monster, but rather meticulously forged in the crucible of a system designed to dehumanize both the enslaved and, in its own insidious way, the enslavers themselves. He had arrived on the plantation years prior, a young man hungry for authority, quickly rising through the ranks due to his unwavering ruthlessness and an almost pathological adherence to the master's will. He had inherited not land, but an ideology, one that viewed human beings as chattel, as mere instruments of labor, their lives expendable, their feelings irrelevant. Jericho's cruelties were often less about explosive rage and more about a chilling, calculated indifference. He denied medical care with a casual shrug, watching feverish children waste away while he meticulously counted bales of cotton. Punishments were arbitrary, often meted out for imagined slights or simply to remind the enslaved of their precarious position. A missed quota, a glance deemed too defiant, a moment of rest too long, any of these could provoke his wrath, manifesting as a public lashing or the dreaded threat of separation from family. He took a perverse pride in breaking spirits, believing that absolute fear was the most effective tool for control. His eyes, often flat and devoid of warmth, would sweep over the fields, searching for any sign of weakness, any flicker of hope he could extinguish. There was, however, a subtle, unspoken tension that had long simmered between Jericho and Elara. While other enslaved people learned to avert their gaze, to shrink in his presence, Elara maintained a quiet dignity that seemed to challenge his very authority without uttering a single word. Her eyes, though seldom meeting his directly, held a depth and an unyielding calm that he found unsettling. She never pleaded, never overtly defied, yet her very being seemed to radiate a strength he couldn't comprehend, much less crush. It was as if she possessed an inner world he could not penetrate, a sanctuary immune to his whips and threats. This silent defiance, this refusal to be completely broken, marked her in his mind, not as an immediate threat, but as a persistent, irritating anomaly, a potential target for his escalating harshness. The community, keenly attuned to the shifting moods of their oppressors, recognized this dynamic. They saw Jericho's cruelty deepen with each passing season, his temper growing shorter, his actions more severe. And they saw Elara, quiet and observant, drawing strength from unseen wells, becoming a silent anchor in their storm-tossed lives. They whispered of her inner resolve, a quality that set her apart, even as they trembled under Jericho's increasingly heavy hand. The stage was being set, not for a simple confrontation, but for a clash of wills, a collision between brute force and the unyielding spirit of a woman whose heritage ran deeper than any chain could ever bind. The air on the plantation grew heavy, charged with the unspoken anxieties of a community pushed to its limits, and the escalating harshness of a man determined to maintain absolute control, unaware of the profound spiritual power he was unwittingly provoking. The very air of the plantation, once merely heavy with the scent of earth and toil, began to thicken with an unbearable dread, a pervasive sense of disrespect that seeped into every crack and crevice of their existence. Overseer Jericho, a man whose cruelty had always been a blunt instrument, now wielded it with a perverse artistry, systematically dismantling the remnants of human dignity with a series of calculated degradations. It was a slow, agonizing corrosion, a deliberate chipping away at their spirits, leaving behind only the raw, exposed nerves of fear and despair. One of the most insidious tactics was the breaking of promises. Time and again, Jericho would dangle small concessions before them: an extra hour of rest on Sunday, a visit to a neighboring plantation to see a separated spouse, a rare holiday meal. The enslaved community, clinging to these fragile threads of hope, would labor with renewed, desperate energy, only to have the promises snatched away at the last moment, often with a sneer or a dismissive wave of the hand. The disappointment was a physical blow, each broken word a fresh wound that festered with distrust and resentment. Ilara watched, her eyes absorbing every instance, the lines of betrayal etched deeper onto the faces of her people, and a quiet, cold anger began to coil within her. She saw how these false hopes were more cruel than outright denial, for they offered a glimpse of freedom, only to plunge them back into a deeper despair. Beyond the broken promises, there were the relentless emotional aggressions. Jericho's voice, a whip in itself, was constantly lashing out, not just with commands, but with demeaning pronouncements designed to strip them of their worth. He would call them beasts of burden, incapable of thought or feeling, publicly mock their attempts at prayer or their traditional songs, and deliver threats that hung in the air like a suffocating fog. These verbal abuses were insidious, targeting not just individuals, but the collective spirit, aiming to instill a profound sense of worthlessness and break any spark of self-respect. The threats were often vague, yet potent, implying not just physical pain, but the ultimate separation from loved ones, a terror that resonated through every heart. Ilara felt the sting of these words, not for herself alone, but for the collective soul of her community, recognizing the deliberate attempt to crush their very identity. The most profound scars, however, were left by the narratives of separation and loss. Ilara had witnessed it countless times: families torn apart at the auction block, children ripped from their mothers' arms, spouses sold away to distant plantations, never to be seen again. Each departure was a small death, a gaping wound in the fabric of their community. She remembered the haunting wails that followed the wagons carrying away loved ones, the silent, hollow grief that lingered for weeks, months, sometimes years. These moments were etched into her memory, indelible scars of helplessness and profound sorrow. The casual brutality with which these sales were executed, often without warning, underscored the absolute powerlessness of the enslaved, reducing human bonds to mere economic transactions. Each tear-streaked face, each broken heart, fueled the slow burning resentment within Ilara, hardening her resolve even as it broke her heart. The physical deprivations further compounded their suffering. Jericho, driven by a callous disregard for their well-being, often withheld necessities. Rations of cornmeal and salt pork were meager, sometimes barely enough to sustain them through the grueling days in the fields. Clothing was threadbare, offering little protection against the biting winter winds or the scorching summer sun. Shelter was rudimentary, leaky cabins where families huddled together, vulnerable to disease and discomfort. This deliberate neglect was not just about control. It was a profound statement of their dehumanization, a constant reminder that their lives held little value beyond their labor. Ilara saw the gaunt faces, the shivering bodies, the constant struggle against hunger and exposure, and understood that this was not merely oversight, but a calculated cruelty designed to keep them weak, compliant, and utterly dependent. Small acts of public humiliation were also part of Jericho's repertoire, designed to reinforce the power dynamics and crush any sense of individual worth. A minor infraction, a dropped tool, a moment of perceived slowness could lead to being forced to wear a crude sign of shame or stand barefoot in the hot sun for hours, or endure a public dressing down designed to belittle and degrade. These were not whippings, but they were equally effective in chipping away at pride and dignity, fostering a pervasive fear of being singled out, of becoming the target of Jericho's capricious wrath. Ilara observed these incidents with a quiet intensity, her heart aching for the humiliation her people endured. She saw the downcast eyes, the bowed heads, the way these small acts compounded the larger injustices, weaving a tapestry of oppression that seemed impossibly dense. Through all these events, Ilara's internal journey was one of quiet observation and a slow, simmering resentment. She rarely spoke out, understanding the futility and danger of open defiance. Instead, she watched, she listened, and she internalized every act of injustice, every broken spirit, every tear shed. The slow burning of anger within her was not a volatile flame, but a deep smoldering ember, fueled by the suffering of her community and her growing understanding of the profound, systemic injustice that permeated their lives. She began to see the plantation not just as a place of labor, but as a crucible where humanity was tested, where spirits were forged or shattered. The collective impact on the enslaved community was palpable. Despair and a pervasive sense of powerlessness began to settle in, a heavy shroud that threatened to extinguish all hope. Yet, beneath the surface, a desperate resilience stirred, a quiet longing for something, anything, to break the suffocating cycle of degradation. Ilara, though outwardly calm, felt the pressure building, a silent scream gathering in her very soul, waiting for an outlet. The suffocating cycle of degradation that had settled over the plantation began to tighten its grip even further. The air, once thick with unspoken fear, now hummed with a palpable dread, a low, persistent thrum beneath the surface of daily life. Overseer Jericho, perhaps sensing the nascent embers of defiance, or simply indulging his own escalating cruelty, became even more volatile and unpredictable. His temper, always a dangerous storm cloud on the horizon, now seemed to gather and break with alarming frequency, unleashing its fury over the smallest infractions. A dropped hoe, a whispered word, a moment of rest too long taken in the scorching sun, each was met with a disproportionate punishment that sent shivers through the enslaved community. The floggings became more frequent, the public humiliations more inventive and degrading, as if Jericho sought to crush every last vestige of human spirit before it could even contemplate resistance. Ilara watched these developments with a heavy heart, each new act of cruelty a fresh wound upon her soul. She saw the fear in the eyes of her people deepen, saw them shrink further into themselves, their shoulders bowed not just by labor, but by the psychological weight of constant terror. Whispers of discontent, once rare and hushed, now rippled more frequently through the cabins at night, though always dampened by the stark reality that open rebellion was a dangerous, often fatal, prospect. The cost of defiance was simply too high, the consequences too dire. Yet the longing for freedom, for dignity, for an end to the ceaseless suffering, burned brighter with each passing day. It wasn't just Jericho's inherent cruelty driving this escalation. Subtle pressures from the outside world seemed to influence him, pushing him to maintain, or even exceed, the prevailing brutality of the era. Rumors carried by the invisible currents of the enslaved communication network spoke of neighboring plantations tightening their grip, of masters enforcing stricter codes, of a heightened vigilance against any spark of uprising. The widespread fear of slave revolts, particularly after events like Nat Turner's rebellion decades prior, meant that any perceived leniency was seen as weakness, an invitation for chaos. Jericho, ever keen to prove his dominion and maintain his reputation among his peers, seemed determined to outdo them all in his ruthlessness, ensuring that his plantation remained a bastion of fear and absolute control. This external pressure only served to amplify the internal suffering, trapping Ilara and her community in an ever-tightening vice. The psychological weight on Ilara was immense. She felt the collective burden of her people, the unspoken pleas in their eyes, the desperate longing for a reprieve. She had always been observant, a quiet vessel for the stories and sorrows of her ancestors. But now, the injustices she witnessed felt personal, searing her conscience. She saw a young mother, barely out of girlhood herself, whipped for dropping a basket of cotton, her cries echoing across the fields, a sound that tore at Ilara's insides. She saw an elderly man, his hands gnarled and trembling from decades of toil, forced to work beyond his strength, collapsing in the sun, only to be dragged back to his feet by Jericho's boot. Each incident was a hammer blow, chipping away at the fragile wall of her endurance, pushing her closer to a precipice she hadn't known existed. But it was a particularly cruel and unjust act against someone vulnerable that truly pushed Ilara to the brink. It was late afternoon, the sun a malevolent orb in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the dusty yard. A small boy, no older than 7, named Thomas, had been caught trying to steal a handful of dried beans from the storeroom. His stomach, distended from chronic hunger, was a testament to the meager rations. Thomas was not defiant, merely desperate, his eyes wide with terror as Jericho loomed over him, whip already in hand. The boy trembled, tears silently streaming down his dirt-streaked face. Ilara, watching from the edge of the field, felt a cold dread grip her heart. This was not about discipline. This was about breaking a child's spirit, about demonstrating absolute, unchallengeable power over the most innocent among them. The sight of Thomas, so small and utterly defenseless, ignited something fierce and protective within Ilara, a primal instinct that transcended fear. It was a raw, aching demand for justice, a silent roar against the unbearable injustice. Jericho, oblivious to the storm brewing in Ilara's quiet gaze, seemed to revel in the boy's terror. He had committed a series of grave errors in recent weeks, each one a strategic miscalculation, born of his implacable ruthlessness and a growing sense of invincibility. He had sold off the last remaining members of a family, separating parents from their children with a casual wave of his hand, ignoring their heart-wrenching pleas. He had denied medical care to a man suffering from a festering wound, leading to his agonizing death, a chilling lesson to anyone who dared to get sick. These actions were not just cruel, they were strategically reckless, isolating him from even the most hardened of his peers, who, though brutal, often understood the pragmatic need for a modicum of control to prevent outright despair. But Jericho had cast aside all such considerations, operating under the delusion that fear alone was sufficient to govern. Now, with Thomas whimpering at his feet, Jericho delivered what would prove to be his final and most profound provocation. He raised the whip, not with the practiced snap of an experienced hand, but with a slow, deliberate motion, savoring the boy's fear. His eyes gleaming with a cold, detached satisfaction. He intended not just to punish, but to utterly shatter. He spoke, his voice a low, gravelly growl that carried across the hushed yard, promising a lesson the boy and everyone else would never forget. It was a declaration of absolute dominion, a stark reminder that no one, not even a starving child, was safe from his capricious wrath. This act, so public, so utterly devoid of compassion, was a direct, personal affront to Ilara's deepest sense of humanity. It struck at the very core of her protective instinct, challenging her to her spiritual limits. The narrative had reached its breaking point. Ilara's patience, a deep well of quiet endurance, was now at its absolute limit. The pressure that had been building within her, the silent scream that had gathered in her soul, was no longer content to remain unspoken. Jericho's implacable ruthlessness, his relentless assault on the dignity and safety of her people, had left her with no further avenues for passive endurance. The existing power dynamic, so long entrenched and seemingly unshakable, was about to shatter. A major defining confrontation was not just imminent, it was inevitable, catalyzed by the horrifying spectacle unfolding before her eyes. The air crackled with an intensity that promised a rupture, a moment where the unbearable would finally give way to the unthinkable. Ilara, her gaze fixed on the trembling child and the raised whip, felt something ancient stir within her, a force that had been dormant for too long, now ready to erupt. The pressure Ilara felt, described at the end of Part 4, was about to find its terrifying release. The suffocating cycle of degradation had spiraled to its inevitable, horrifying peak, and the air on the plantation was no longer just heavy with unspoken fear, but thrumming with a palpable sense of impending doom. Jericho's temper, already volatile, had become a storm of unpredictable rage. Minor infractions, once met with a cruel word or a small public humiliation, now risked a severe lashing. The whispers of discontent among the enslaved community had grown louder, more desperate, though the danger of open rebellion remained a stark, lethal deterrent. Ilara had watched, her heart a raw wound as the daily terrors escalated, each act of cruelty chipping away at the fragile hope that flickered in the eyes of her people. She had seen the despair, felt the weight of it in her own bones, and knew that something had to give. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering afternoon, a day indistinguishable from countless others in its oppressive heat and endless labor. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, named Josiah, had been caught attempting to sneak a meager handful of cornmeal, driven by the gnawing hunger that was a constant companion. Jericho, his face contorted into a mask of cold fury, dragged the terrified child before the assembled field hands. Josiah's eyes, wide with fear, darted to Ilara, a silent plea in their depths. The overseer's voice, a whip crack in itself, declared that this act of theft would be made an example of, a lesson to all. He ordered Josiah tied to the whipping post, a gnarled, scarred tree that stood as a monument to suffering. The boy's small frame trembled, and a whimper escaped his lips, a sound that tore through Ilara's soul like a jagged blade. Ilara felt an overwhelming surge of emotion, a torrent that threatened to consume her. It was not just anger, though a righteous fury burned within her. It was a profound sorrow, a primal need to protect this innocent child, to somehow intervene against the unspeakable horror about to unfold. Every injustice she had witnessed, every broken promise, every tear shed, every life torn apart, culminated in this single, unbearable moment. The image of Josiah's terrified face, so young, so vulnerable, shattered any remaining thread of passive endurance. Something deep within her, an ancient, ancestral spirit, stirred and demanded expression. It transcended conscious decision. It was an instinctual, spiritual response, a raw, desperate yearning for humanity to prevail against such boundless cruelty. She took a single, deliberate step forward, her eyes locked on Josiah, then on Jericho, who stood, whip raised, his shadow falling over the trembling boy. Then, from deep within Ilara, a sound began to emanate. It was not a shout, not a plea, but a soft, almost imperceptible hum that started in her chest, a low, resonant vibration. It was a sound,